Somewhere in the year 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire ended. Just like that. An empire that had lasted over 1,000 years, that had conquered most of the known world, that had given us roads and law and language, just stopped existing. And here's the part that should bother you. Nobody wrote down the exact day it happened. Think about that for a second. We know the date the Titanic sank. We know the date the Berlin Wall fell. We can practically tell you what time zone it was in when certain empires collapsed centuries ago. But Rome, the empire that basically invented the idea of writing things down for the record, doesn't have a documented death certificate. No chronicler sat there in September of 476 and wrote, "Today, the empire ended." Nobody knew. Or if they did know, they didn't think it was worth mentioning. That's the mystery we're diving into today. How does the most powerful state in the ancient world just quietly slip away without anyone marking the occasion? And at the centre of it all are two names you've probably never heard unless you're a serious history nerd. Romulus Augustulus, a teenage boy who becomes emperor almost as a joke, and Odoacer, the barbarian general who ends up deciding he simply doesn't need an emperor anymore. We're going to walk through how Rome got to this point. Centuries of slow decline, pressure from migrating peoples, cities getting sacked not once but twice, and a series of what historians now call kingmakers, warlords, who controlled emperors like puppets long before Odoacer ever showed up. We're going to sit in the room, or as close as we can get, for the actual moment of deposition, the day the last Western emperor supposedly hands over power. And then we're going to play historical detective, because the honest truth is we don't know the exact date. We're piecing this together from later writers, second-hand accounts, contradictory sources, and educated guesswork. Along the way, we'll ask why almost nobody at the time seemed to care. We'll look at how the Eastern Roman Empire, still very much alive and calling itself Roman, saw all of this. And we'll talk about a guy named Edward Gibbon, who, over 1,000 years later, basically invented the year 476 as the official fall of Rome, whether ancient people agreed with him or not. If you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to history, or just likes having your brain gently rewired while you drift off, stick around because this one goes deep. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing that. Last one I checked was someone in Manila at 2 in the morning, and someone in Toronto just waking up for work, all listening to the same story about a dead empire. It's wild. Also, if you want the easiest way to support this channel, following the show on Spotify does more than you'd think. The link's in the description. Costs nothing. Takes 5 seconds. Alright, let's rewind the clock. Not just to 476, but centuries earlier, to understand how an empire this massive could end up dying so quietly that nobody bothered to write down the date. Let's start around the year 235 AD, because that's when things really start to wobble. For about 50 years, roughly from 235 to 284, Rome goes through what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century. And crisis might actually be underselling it. In those 5 decades, the empire burns through something like 26 different emperors. Some historians count more depending on how you define legitimate rule. Some of these guys lasted years, some lasted weeks. One emperor, Gordian I, ruled for about 3 weeks before things fell apart so badly he took his own life. This wasn't leadership. This was a revolving door with a body count. Why was this happening? Mostly money and soldiers, which, let's be honest, is usually the answer to why any empire starts falling apart. The Roman economy was cracking under the weight of constant warfare. Emperors needed cash to pay armies, so they debased the currency, mixing cheaper metals into coins that were supposed to be silver. Inflation exploded, trade slowed down, and meanwhile the borders were under pressure like never before. Germanic groups were pushing in from the north. The Sassanid Persian Empire was flexing hard in the east. Rome was essentially fighting a two-front war it never fully signed up for, and the strain was tearing the political system apart from the inside. Here's the thing about Roman succession that made this whole crisis almost inevitable. There was never a clean, reliable system for choosing the next emperor. No clear line of succession like a hereditary monarchy, no election like a modern republic. Instead, whoever controlled the loyalty of the legions basically controlled the empire. So generals started realizing they didn't need permission from Rome to become emperor. They just needed enough soldiers willing to declare them emperor and enough force to make it stick. This created a pattern that would haunt Rome for the rest of its existence. Military strongmen deciding who got to wear the purple, sometimes for the good of the empire, sometimes purely for their own ambition, and increasingly it became impossible to tell the difference. Then, in 284, a guy named Diocletian shows up and basically says, "Enough." Diocletian was a career soldier, rose through the ranks the hard way, and when he took power, he looked at this chaos and came to a conclusion that must have felt almost heretical at the time. The empire was too big for one person to run, not too big geographically in some abstract sense, too big practically. Communication took weeks. Threats could appear on opposite ends of the map simultaneously. No single human being, no matter how competent, could react fast enough to hold it all together. So Diocletian did something radical. He split the empire's administration into 4 parts, a system historians call the Tetrarchy, meaning rule of 4. 2 senior emperors called Augusti, one for the east, one for the west, each with a junior emperor called a Caesar, meant to eventually succeed them. On paper, it was elegant. 4 leaders, 4 regions, faster response times, built-in succession planning so you wouldn't get another 50-year bloodbath every time somebody died. In practice, it was messy and didn't survive Diocletian's own retirement, but the core idea stuck around in a way that mattered enormously. Rome was no longer going to be governed as a single unified centre radiating out in every direction. It was starting to think of itself as 2 halves. That idea got turbocharged by the next major figure in this story, Constantine. Constantine eventually reunified the empire under one ruler again, after a series of civil wars, but he made a decision that would shape the next 150 years more than almost anything else in this period. In 330 AD, he founded a new capital in the east, on the site of an old Greek city called Byzantium. He named it after himself, Constantinople. And this wasn't just vanity, or at least not only vanity. The eastern Mediterranean was wealthier, better connected by trade, closer to the frontiers that actually mattered most at the time. Rome, meanwhile, was getting further and further from where the real action was happening. Think about what this does symbolically and practically. For centuries, Rome had been the centre of gravity, the place all roads led to, quite literally. Now there's a second capital, arguably a more strategically useful one, pulling resources, attention, and political power eastward. It's like a company slowly moving its headquarters to a new city while still keeping the old building open. Eventually, people start wondering which one is really in charge. The formal split, the one most historians point to as the real administrative divorce, happens under Emperor Theodosius I. When Theodosius dies in 395, he divides the empire between his 2 sons. Honorius gets the west, Arcadius gets the east, and this time the division sticks. Permanently, as it turns out, though nobody at the time necessarily knew that. From this point forward, there are 2 separate imperial administrations, 2 separate courts, 2 separate sets of problems. Even though officially, in theory, they're still considered one empire, just governed by 2 emperors who are supposed to cooperate. Except cooperation gets harder every year, because the two halves are heading in very different directions. The Eastern Empire has Constantinople, wealthy trade routes, defensible borders, and a tax base that can actually support an army. The Western Empire has Rome, an increasingly symbolic capital, shrinking tax revenue and borders stretched along the Rhine and Danube that are under constant pressure from groups migrating in from the north and east. And here's where we get to one of the most important, most underappreciated shifts in this entire story: the West's growing reliance on foederati. These were Germanic groups, tribes and confederations like the Goths, who entered into treaties with Rome, agreeing to provide military service in exchange for land, payment, or some form of autonomy. On paper, this sounds like a smart solution. Rome doesn't have enough native manpower or money to field massive citizen armies anymore, so it outsources military power to groups who are willing and able to fight. But think about what this actually means long term. The Western Roman army increasingly becomes an army of Germanic soldiers, led in many cases by Germanic generals, loyal not necessarily to the idea of Rome, but to their own commanders, their own people, their own interests. Rome isn't just borrowing muscle anymore, it's becoming structurally dependent on the very groups it once considered barbarian outsiders. This is a Rome that increasingly can't defend itself without the people who might eventually decide they don't need Rome at all. And this is really the core reason the West ends up structurally weaker than the East, even though both halves faced similar pressures. The East had the wealth, the trade networks, and the tax revenue to maintain its own professional forces and, frankly, to buy off invaders when necessary. The West didn't. The West kept leaning harder and harder on foreign soldiers, foreign generals, and foreign kings until eventually the people holding the swords were the ones holding the actual power. And that, as we're about to see, sets up everything that follows. Because the pressure on Rome's western frontier wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was about to get dramatically, catastrophically worse. To understand how bad it got, you have to zoom out from Rome for a second and look at what was happening way beyond the imperial borders, out on the Eurasian steppe. Because the people battering at Rome's frontiers in the late 4th and early 5th centuries weren't moving in a vacuum. They were being pushed somewhere out in the grasslands north of the Black Sea and further east. A new power was on the rise, the Huns. We don't have their memoirs. Most of what we know comes from terrified Roman observers and later writers trying to make sense of the chaos. But across our sources, a pattern emerges. Around the 370s, mounted groups using fast cavalry tactics start crashing into the peoples who'd been living along Rome's northeastern fringes for generations. Goths, Alans, other steppe and forest peoples. The Huns hit them like a shockwave. And when a shockwave hits one layer, it doesn't stop there. It passes the pressure along. Gothic groups living north of the Danube suddenly face something they can't handle on their own. Raids, displacement, whole communities getting uprooted. Some Gothic leaders try to fight, some get wiped out. Others make a different calculation. If something worse than Rome has appeared behind you, then the Roman Empire suddenly doesn't look like the enemy. It looks like a wall, so huge numbers of Goths move toward that wall. In 376, a mass of Turingian Goths under leaders like Fritigern appear on the Danube and ask permission to cross into imperial territory. Not as raiders, but as refugees. This is one of those moments where you can feel history pivoting on decisions made by men who did not understand the scale of the forces they were dealing with. The Roman leadership says yes, in theory, they'll let the Goths in as foederati, settled inside the empire in exchange for military service. On paper, this is just extending a policy Rome has used for decades. In reality, the scale is new. We're not talking about a few thousand warriors. We're talking about entire peoples, with families, elders, their own leaders and laws, trying to transplant themselves inside the imperial system. and Rome is not equipped for this. Corrupt officials starve the Gothic refugees, sell them dog meat at extortionate prices, abuse them, seize their children as slaves. The situation explodes. The Goths revolt. The result in 378 is the Battle of Adrianople, where the Eastern Emperor Valens leads a Roman army against them and ends up dead on the field. A huge chunk of the Eastern Field army is destroyed. Contemporaries understood this as a disaster on the scale of Cannae. For the first time in living memory, a large Roman force, led by an emperor, is annihilated by a group that Rome still wants to think of as barbarians. But the story doesn't end with a clean Roman victory or a clean Roman defeat. It ends in a messy compromise. Into this mess steps Theodosius, the same emperor whose death will later split east and west between his sons. He makes peace with the Goths, settles many of them inside imperial territory as semi-autonomous allies, and crucially allows them to remain under their own leaders. Not fully integrated Roman citizens, not fully independent outsiders, something in between. One of the men who grows up in this in-between world is a Gothic noble named Alaric. Alaric's story is the story of the late Roman West in miniature. He fights for Rome as a federate commander, possibly even serving under Theodosius himself. He sees battle, earns prestige, and watches how essential Gothic soldiers have become to Roman armies. But he also sees how little respect and security that service actually buys his people. When Theodosius dies in 395, and the empire formally splits between his sons Aurorius and Arcadius, the political centre of gravity shifts again. Power struggles erupt at court. Military strongmen like Stilicho in the west and Rufinus in the east manoeuvre for control over the boy emperors. In the chaos, Alaric looks at his position and decides if Rome can't or won't take care of the Goths, maybe he will. He is proclaimed king of the Visigoths and begins a decades-long negotiation by force with the Roman state. This is where the relationship gets really complicated. Alaric isn't some cartoon invader whose only goal is to burn Rome to the ground. For years, his main demand is remarkably consistent: secure land and formal status for his people inside the empire, and a recognized command for himself within the Roman hierarchy. He wants a deal. He wants guarantees. He wants Rome to admit, in writing and in gold, that the Goths are indispensable. Rome, especially the Western court holed up in the safer city of Ravenna, keeps trying to have it both ways. They use Alaric and other Gothic forces when convenient, then stall, backtrack, or refuse when it comes time to pay or grant land. Alaric responds the only way someone in his position can. He marches. He marches into Italy. Over and over across the first decade of the 400s, there's this strange dance. Alaric advances, negotiations open, concessions are made, then hardliners in Ravenna balk at giving too much to a barbarian talks collapse. The cycle repeats. The Roman Senate in Rome itself is caught in the middle, increasingly powerless to influence events that determine their own survival. Finally, in 408, things spin completely out of control. Stilicho, the one general who has both the authority and the military skill to manage Alaric and defend Italy, is executed in a palace coup. His Gothic troops are massacred or driven into Alaric's arms. Overnight, Rome loses its strongest defender and hands its most dangerous opponent a flood of embittered recruits. By 409 and 410, Alaric has Rome, the city of Rome, under siege. Not as some symbolic gesture, but as direct pressure on the Western government. He demands grain, money, and above all a binding agreement to settle his people in a stable homeland. Ravenna still hesitates. Honorius, surrounded by courtiers and marshes, clings to an idea of imperial dignity his army can no longer enforce. And Alaric, watching his leverage erode with every delay, makes a decision no one in the Roman world really believes he will make until it happens. In August of 410, his forces enter Rome, and for 3 days they loot the city. To grasp the impact of this, you have to see it through Roman eyes. Rome hadn't been taken by a foreign enemy in almost 800 years. The city that had conquered the Mediterranean, that had withstood Hannibal, that had survived civil wars and plagues, was supposed to be untouchable. Even after the political centre shifted to Ravenna and Constantinople, Rome was still Rome, the sacred core, overflowing with imperial monuments, temples and churches. And now it was being sacked by a king whose ancestors had once begged to be let inside the empire for protection. How bad was the damage? Ancient accounts vary. Some writers emphasize restraint, churches like St. Peter's used as sanctuaries, limited slaughter, an attempt by Alaric to control his men. Others focus on the trauma, houses stripped, aristocrats ransomed or killed, sacred spaces violated, slaves fleeing into the chaos. Most modern historians think it was devastating, but not total destruction. Rome was not burned to the ground. It did not become a ghost city overnight. But psychologically, it was an earthquake. News of the sack spread fast across the Mediterranean. In North Africa, in Gaul, in the eastern provinces, people heard that the unimaginable had happened. The eternal city had been breached. Some pagans saw it as proof that abandoning the old gods for Christianity had doomed Rome. Some Christians panicked that the end times were at hand. Others tried to fit the disaster into a divine plan. In Hippo, in North Africa, a bishop named Augustine listened to these arguments and wrote a response that would become one of the most influential works in Western history, The City of God. In it, he takes the sack head-on. The fall of Rome, he argues, is not the fall of God's order. Earthly states rise and fall. The earthly city is transient, corruptible, mortal. The city of God is something else entirely, spiritual, enduring, not bound to any particular empire. Augustine is, in a way, doing crisis therapy for an entire civilization. He's trying to convince his readers that the shattering of Rome's invincible image does not mean the shattering of all meaning. But the fact that he has to make that argument tells you how profound the shock was. People really were asking whether history itself had broken. After 410, everyone knows something they could sort of avoid thinking about before. Rome can be beaten from the inside. Its aura of inevitability, of permanent dominance is cracked. Not destroyed, the empire continues. Armies still march, emperors still issue laws, but visibly fractured. And once that mental barrier falls, once kings like Alaric prove you can hang an imperial city out to dry and walk away alive, it changes how everyone, from frontier warlords to Roman generals, calculates risk. The game is still whack-a-mole, but suddenly one of the moles has smashed the hammer and everyone is watching to see what happens next. If 410 showed that Rome could be hurt, the next 4 decades would show that it could be strangled. While Augustine was writing in Hippo, another story was unfolding just down the North African coast. A people the Romans had once treated as just one more troublesome group in Spain were in the middle of a transformation. Under a hard, calculating king named Genseric, the Vandals were turning from wandering refugees into something Rome had never really confronted before on that front, a rival maritime power. The Vandals had crossed from Spain into Roman Africa in 429, invited in by one Roman faction as muscle against another. This was becoming a pattern. Western politicians, desperate to win their own civil wars, kept hiring barbarians to fight other Romans. Genseric accepted the job, then did what a lot of those hired allies eventually did. He stopped playing by Roman rules. Over the 430s, his forces pushed along the North African coast. They fought Roman field armies. They cut deals with local elites. They exploited every crack in imperial authority. There were treaties, then betrayals, then new treaties. By 439, in a move that shocked even jaded contemporaries, Genseric seized Carthage itself. Carthage wasn't just any city. Since the days of the Republic, it had been one of Rome's richest possessions, the hub of a whole provincial system. Its estates and plantations produced something Italy literally could not live without at that scale: grain. For centuries, the rhythm of life in Rome had depended on those shipments. Huge fleets carried African grain to feed hundreds of thousands of people on subsidized rations. Take that away, and you don't just inconvenience the Senate. You threaten the basic food security of the capital and much of the Western regime. When Genseric took Carthage, he didn't immediately burn everything and slaughter everyone. He did something more dangerous. He took over the tax base. He took over the docks. He took over the shipyards. He took over the fleets. Almost overnight, Rome's former province became the Vandal kingdom of North Africa, with Carthage as its royal capital. Genseric minted his own coins, negotiated his own foreign policy, and crucially began launching raids across the Mediterranean. Sicily, Sardinia, the coasts of Italy and Gaul, places that had once thought of sea power as a Roman monopoly, suddenly discovered that the sea could now deliver enemies instead of supplies. The loss of Carthage and its hinterland didn't just mean some aristocrats in Italy lost profits. It meant the Western government had to scramble every year to secure enough grain from elsewhere, at higher cost, in smaller quantities, through more vulnerable routes. The treasury, already strained by decades of war and internal turmoil, started to choke. Imagine trying to run what was left of the Western Empire, while your main source of food, tax revenue, and naval capacity is now controlled by a man whose entire strategy depends on your desperation. That was the new normal, and Genseric understood exactly how much leverage he had. In Rome, imperial politics kept imploding. Emperors rose and fell. Powerful generals assassinated rivals. The court migrated between cities. Through all of this, Genseric stayed put in Carthage, watching, plotting, cutting bargains when it suited him, breaking them when it didn't. He signed a treaty in 442 that recognized his hold on much of Africa. To many Romans it felt like amputation, but they were in no position to reattach the limb. Then, in 455, Rome handed Genseric a pretext. The Western Emperor Valentinian III murdered his top general Aetius, the same man who had fought Attila the Hun. A few months later, Valentinian himself was assassinated in a coup led by a senator named Petronius Maximus. Maximus married Valentinian's widow, Eudoxia, trying to legitimize his seizure of power. According to some sources, Eudoxia hated him and secretly appealed to Genseric for help. Whether or not that story happened exactly as later writers tell it, what matters is that Genseric had all the excuse he needed: a broken marriage alliance, a disputed succession, Roman-on-Roman murder. In Vandal diplomatic language, this was instability you could drive a fleet through. In June of 455, Vandal ships appeared at the mouth of the Tiber. Rome, still traumatized from 410, and now politically leaderless, Maximus would be killed by a mob as he tried to flee, faced a new crisis with even fewer resources. This time, there was one figure of continuity and authority, ready to step forward: the Bishop of Rome. Pope Leo XXX, the same man who had gone out to meet Attila 4 years earlier, and persuaded him to turn away from Italy, went to negotiate with Genseric. Later, Christian writers would remember Leo as almost miraculously effective. With Attila, the story goes, his words, backed by the aura of the church, and maybe some pragmatic promises of gold, convinced the Hun king to spare Rome. With Genseric, the accounts are different. There's no version where the Vandals simply go home. What most sources agree on is this: Leo begged for mercy. He asked Genseric not to burn the city, not to massacre its inhabitants. Genseric, whether out of piety, calculation, or simple pragmatism, seems to have agreed to some limits. But he did not agree to spare Rome. For 2 weeks, much longer than Alaric's 3-day sack, the Vandals systematically stripped the city. Temples, public buildings, aristocratic mansions, imperial palaces, anything portable and valuable was fair game. Gold and silver plate, statues, furniture, religious treasures. One of the later stories has them carrying off the spoils of the Jerusalem temple that Titus had once paraded through Rome, loaded now onto Vandal ships as just more loot. Was it more brutal than 410? It depends what you measure. Some ancient writers, especially those hostile to the Vandals, emphasize sacrilege and cruelty. Others suggest that, again, there was limited killing and some respect for churches as sanctuaries, in line with Leo's plea. But even if the bloodshed was constrained, the scale and duration of the plundering were on another level. It felt less like a chaotic eruption, more like a controlled extraction. And there was a new, humiliating detail. The attackers sailed in, did their work, and sailed away with no Roman navy strong enough to stop them. Among the captives taken back to Africa were members of the imperial family, including Valentinian's widow and daughters. Rome wasn't just looted. It was publicly shown to be unable to protect even the people at the top of its social pyramid. For Roman observers, especially those old enough to remember the pre-410 world, the cumulative psychological effect was crushing. First, the city that had stood inviolable for centuries had been stormed by land. Now it had been harvested from the sea, its treasures bundled off to a foreign court that claimed former Roman provinces as its own kingdom. The old mental map, with Rome at the centre, and everyone else on the periphery, no longer matched reality. Writers in the decades after 455 start to sound different. There's still pride, still appeals to Roman law and Roman identity, but also a kind of exhausted resignation. The West was not just losing battles, it was losing the infrastructure and wealth that had once made recovery possible. Africa was gone. The grain fleets were Vandal. Emperors depended on barbarian generals. Popes mediated with foreign kings. Leo's diplomacy had saved lives and buildings. It had not saved the illusion that Rome, by virtue of being Rome, would always bounce back. By the time we get to 476, people in Italy have lived through famine scares, Hunnic invasions, civil wars, and not one but 2 sacks of the Eternal City. The fall that no one would date precisely was being prepared not by a single decisive blow, but by this long series of shocks, each one chipping away at what it meant to be Roman, until the title of emperor itself started to feel like just another piece on the board. By the time the Vandals were sailing in and out of Italian waters at will, another quieter revolution was happening inside the imperial system itself. The Romans still had emperors. They still minted coins with imperial portraits, still issued laws in an emperor's name, still pretended that the man on the throne was the axis around which politics turned. But in the mid-400s, if you stood in the palace in Ravenna and asked, who actually runs this place? The honest answer was not the emperor. It was a man most Romans would have called a barbarian. His name was Ricimer. Ricimer was exactly the kind of figure the 5th century kept producing, a stranger who had become in many ways more Roman than the Romans, and yet could never quite belong. His family background seems to have been a mix of Suevic and Gothic nobility, people who had fought Rome and then served it. He grew up in an empire where Germanic soldiers filled the ranks, where command of a field army mattered more than the old senatorial pedigree. He was baptized a Christian. He spoke Latin. He fought Rome's enemies and rose up the chain of command. On paper, he was a loyal Roman general. In reality, Ricimer embodied the new logic of power in the West. Whoever controlled the troops controlled the state. There was one thing he could not be. As far as the Roman political imagination was concerned, an emperor still had to be Roman, at least nominally descended from the old citizen stock, plugged into the aristocratic networks, palatable to the Senate, acceptable to Constantinople. A man with Ricimer's background could be the sword arm of the regime but not its face. So he did the obvious workaround. He made emperors instead. In 456, after yet another round of civil war and dynastic chaos, Ricimer emerged at the head of the Western army. He defeated a rival general in Italy, secured his position, and then went shopping for an emperor. The man he picked, Avitus, was a Gallic aristocrat with ties to the powerful landowners in what is now France. Avitus got the purple, Ricimer got the troops. It did not last. Avitus turned out to be unpopular in Italy, too close to Gallic interests, too dependent on Visigothic allies for Roman tastes. When famine and political resistance hit, Ricimer discovered that the emperor he had made was now a liability. In 456-457, he turned on Avitus, defeated him, and had him deposed. The imperial office, theoretically sacred and inviolable, was now something you could cancel if the man wearing the diadem became inconvenient. This became a pattern. Ricimer could not sit on the throne himself, but he could treat it like a chair he rearranged whenever the room needed redecorating. He backed Majorian, a talented soldier with real reformist energy, in 457. Majorian tried to rebuild the Western military, tighten tax collection, and even launch a major expedition to retake North Africa from the Vandals. For a brief moment, it looked like the old Roman script might play out one more time. Strong emperor, successful campaigns, central authority restored. Then reality intervened. Majorian's African expedition failed before it even got going. His fleet was destroyed in Spain, probably with Vandal help. His reforms threatened too many entrenched interests. His growing prestige worried Ricimer himself. A charismatic emperor with his own loyal army is the one thing a kingmaker cannot tolerate. In 461, Ricimer solved the problem the way he always did. He arrested Majorian, forced him to abdicate, and had him executed. Then he picked another emperor. If you map the Western emperors from 455 to 472, you don't really see a succession of rulers. You see ricochets of Ricimer's influence, Avitus made and unmade, Majorian made and killed, Libius Severus, a non-entity acceptable precisely because he would not get in the way. When Constantinople refused to recognize Severus, Ricimer ruled anyway, issuing orders in the emperor's name, negotiating with barbarian kings, managing Italian politics. On the coinage and in the official documents, the emperor was still there. In practice, the important question in any crisis was, what does Ricimer want? To senators, bishops, and provincial governors, this was both familiar and alien. Strong generals had always mattered in Roman politics. Men like Stilicho and Aetius, not coincidentally also of mixed Roman barbarian background, had dominated courts and commanded armies. But there had usually been some sense that the emperor, if he survived the coups and intrigues, could still be the final arbiter, the symbol of continuity. Under Ricimer, that illusion thinned. People could see that the august occupant of the throne might be here for a year or two, and then vanish, replaced by the next candidate who best suited the man with the soldiers. This had consequences far beyond court gossip. If you're a landowner in Gaul, a bishop in Spain, or a local commander in Dalmatia, and you watch emperors appear and disappear at the whim of a general, you start hedging. You make local deals, you look to your regional strongman, your nearest barbarian king, your city council rather than Ravenna, for long-term guarantees. Loyalty to the imperial centre stops being an obvious bet and becomes just one option among many. The Eastern Court took note, too, in Constantinople. Emperors and ministers watched the Western carousel of rulers with increasing suspicion. They sometimes refused to recognise Ricimer's picks, preferring to keep their own candidate in reserve. The idea that there was a single coherent Roman Empire with two cooperative halves began to look more like a legal fiction. Ricimer himself never tried to tear the system down. He needed the empire to exist, at least as a framework. The Senate, the laws, the imperial mint, the prestige of Roman titles, all of that gave cover to his own authority. He was operating a shadow empire, not founding a new one. To contemporaries, it probably felt less like a clean break, and more like living under a series of regencies that somehow never ended. But the precedent he set was decisive. He showed that you could be an outsider by birth, command barbarian and Roman troops, and effectively run the Western Empire without ever calling yourself emperor. He demonstrated that the purple was a tool, not an identity, a useful prop to legitimize the decisions made in the general's tent. After Ricimer's death in 472, the pattern didn't stop. Other strongmen stepped into the vacuum, trying to replicate his role with less skill and less legitimacy. Civil wars flared. Puppet emperors multiplied and shrank in stature. The title that had once belonged to Augustus and Trajan now clung to men who could barely control Italy, men who lasted months instead of decades. When Odoacer finally walked into this world of hollowed-out institutions and disposable emperors, he didn't have to invent a new model of power. He just had to push Ricimer's logic to its endpoint. If a barbarian general can already choose emperors, why keep choosing? Ricimer was dead, but the system he'd built was still running, just with worse operators. After 472, the Western Court in Ravenna went through emperors the way a desperate gambler goes through loans. Ricimer's immediate successor as power behind the throne, a Burgundian general named Gundobad, tried to play the same game. He backed a new emperor, Glyceris. Constantinople refused to recognize him. Provincial elites hedged harder than ever. The Western purple, already tarnished, started to look counterfeit. Somewhere in this chaos, a man named Orestes was watching very closely. Orestes was not a nobody. Decades earlier, he'd served on the staff of Attila the Hun, part of the strange cosmopolitan entourage that clustered around the Hunnic court. That alone tells you a lot about him. He was one of those late Roman operators who could move between worlds, Latin and Gothic, Roman law and steppe politics, because by the mid-400s that was what survival required. After Attila's death and the breakup of the Hunnic Confederation, Orestes drifted back into imperial service. He became a trusted official under the Western Emperor Julius Nepos, who had been sent from Constantinople in 474 as the East's latest attempt to stabilize the crumbling West with one decisive personnel change. On paper, Nepos was exactly what the situation required. Recognized by the Eastern Court, tied into Dalmatian and Balkan power networks, young enough to have energy, legitimate enough to claim continuity. Orestes served as his Magister Militum, the same job Ricimer had used as a springboard to power. In practice, Nepos faced the same problems as every late Western emperor: an empty treasury, unpaid troops, powerful barbarian federates on Italian soil, and a senatorial class that wanted security and tax relief more than grand imperial projects. When someone in that environment commands the army and the emperor can't pay it, you don't need a crystal ball to see where things are heading. In 475, the pattern repeated. Orestes refused to be just another general propping up a ruler chosen somewhere else. Backed by the troops under his command, many of them Germanic foederati settled in Italy, he turned on Julius Nepos. The emperor fled across the Adriatic to Dalmatia, where he set up a kind of exile court and continued to insist, with some legal justification, that he was still the rightful Western Augustus. Orestes did not bother to hunt him down. He didn't need a corpse, he needed a crown. But here he faced the same barrier that had stopped Ricimer. However far the west had drifted, there were still lines most people thought you shouldn't cross. A man with Orestes' background, a provincial from Pannonia, recently the associate of Attila, dependent on barbarian troops, was a hard sell as emperor to the traditional aristocracy. Constantinople, already annoyed about the overthrow of their chosen man, was not going to smile on a self-elevated warlord. So Orestes copied the workaround with a twist. Instead of elevating a seasoned senator or another respectable general, he reached for someone he could control more completely, his own son. The boy's name was Romulus, to Romans with a sense of history, and that was pretty much all of them. That name was loaded. Romulus was the legendary founder of the city, the child raised by a she-wolf, the man who had drawn the first sacred boundary of Rome on the Palatine Hill. To put a Romulus on the throne in the empire's twilight was either a bold attempt at symbolic renewal or an inside joke at history's expense. Later writers add another layer. They call him Romulus Augustulus. Augustus was the honorific that had given the first emperor his title. Augustulus is a diminutive, little Augustus, half affectionate, half belittling. It might have been a nickname used at court or a label invented later to underscore the smallness, literal and metaphorical, of the last Western emperor compared to the first. Put the two names together and the irony writes itself. The empire that had begun with Augustus ruling over a city founded by Romulus ended with a little Augustus named Romulus reigning over a shrunken Italy from a damp palace in Ravenna. We don't know exactly how old he was. Ancient sources imply he was very young, maybe 10, maybe in his early teens, old enough to wear the purple and sit on a throne in ceremonial processions, too young to command an army or dictate policy. On every coin, every legal formula, the empire now spoke in the name of a child. From the moment he was elevated in 475, his legitimacy was under a cloud. Julius Nepos was still alive, still officially recognized by the Eastern Emperor, still issuing decrees from Dalmatia. That meant the Roman world had in effect two Western emperors, the legal one in exile and the convenient one in Ravenna. Provinces and bishops had to decide whose name went in their prayers and their documents. Many chose Nepos, others simply waited to see who survived. Even in Italy, everyone understood how this worked. Romulus was emperor because his father held the army's loyalty. Take away that military backing, and the imperial boy in Ravenna was just a teenager in fancy clothes. Orestes' political base was narrow. He depended on the same volatile mix that had propped up Ricimer, a corps of barbarian federate troops who wanted land and security, and a nervous Italian elite that would tolerate almost anything in exchange for order. The foederati expected Orestes to pay them in the coin they valued most: formal grants of land in Italy for their families. The senators hoped he would resist that, to avoid slicing up their estates. That's not a stable coalition. It's a time bomb with two fuses, so when people later talk about the last Roman emperor, they often picture a tragic boy watching his world collapse. But from the outset, Romulus Augustulus was less a ruler than a symptom, the final, almost absurd expression of a system where generals made emperors and emperors no longer made decisions. All it would take to end his reign was one more general, with one more army, who decided that even a boy on the throne was now unnecessary. That general was already in the room. When Orestes seized power, one of the men whose support he relied on was a tall, battle-hardened commander of the Germanic foederati. The sources don't agree on exactly who he was, or even exactly what he was. They just agree on his name, Odoacer, or Odovacar, or Odovacarus. Late Roman writers spell it a few different ways, which is our first clue that he sat at an awkward angle to their world. Not quite Roman enough to have a familiar Latin name, not exotic enough to be entirely alien. He was from that blurry frontier zone where identity was less like a neat label and more like a set of overlapping circles. Later chroniclers call him a Syrian, from a small Germanic people whose original homeland probably lay somewhere north of the lower Danube or around the Black Sea. Others link him to the Rugians or the Heruli. Some modern historians think his father was a Syrian chieftain serving in Roman forces, his mother from another Germanic group. A few Byzantine writers, puzzled by his prestige, even try to connect him to old royal lines, as if greatness required a pedigree. The honest answer is, we don't know for sure. His ethnic background was probably mixed, and that's precisely what made him so perfectly late Roman. Imagine growing up in that environment. Your father, Ideco, had once rubbed shoulders with Attila's lieutenants and Roman envoys. Maybe he wore Roman military belts and drank from Roman silver, but led men who spoke Germanic dialects around the campfire. Maybe your earliest memories are of wagon trains and river crossings, of garrison towns along the Danube where Latin curses mingled with Gothic jokes. By the mid-400s, this was an ordinary childhood for thousands of boys along the frontier. The empire had been recruiting barbarians for generations. By Odoacer's time, those recruits weren't just filling the ranks, they were the ranks. He almost certainly entered Roman service young, as many ambitious Federate sons did. We don't see his early career in the sources, but his later position tells us enough. You don't end up at the head of the foederati in Italy by accident. That job went to men who had proven they could fight, negotiate, and above all keep volatile warriors in line. Life among the foederati was its own little universe. These weren't mercenaries in the old sense, hired for one campaign and dismissed. They were entire communities, families, elders, warriors bound to Rome by treaties. In exchange for military service, they expected land to farm, legal security, and a share in the imperial spoils. Their children grew up half inside the empire, praying in Latin churches, trading in Roman markets, sometimes marrying local women, but still keeping their own leaders and their own sense of us and them. For someone like Odoacer, that line was negotiable. He would have learned Latin commands and Roman drill, maybe even read the basics of imperial law if he moved in higher circles. But his authority rested on the trust of men who followed him because he was one of them, a warrior who shared their background, their grievances, their sense that Rome owed them something it was no longer delivering. By the 470s, that frustration was white-hot. The Italian foederati had fought under Ricimer, and then under Orestes. They'd watched emperors appear and vanish while their pay fell into arrears, and the promises of permanent land grants kept being discussed and postponed. They saw senators with vast estates still mostly intact. They saw imperial palaces still being maintained. They saw, in other words, that there was wealth in Italy. It just wasn't flowing to them. If you're commanding those troops, you sit at the crossroads of two pressures. On one side, a Roman general like Orestes, who needs your support to keep his boy emperor on the throne. On the other, your own warriors, asking when their families will finally get farms instead of billets, fields instead of IOUs. Odoacer's ambitions were almost certainly shaped by that squeeze. Did he start his career wanting to end the Western Empire? Probably not, That's the kind of tidy narrative later ages impose. His likely motivations were more immediate. Secure land and status for his men. Carve out a stable power base for himself in a system that kept chewing up strongmen and spitting them out. But ambition doesn't always announce itself with a manifesto. It grows in the cracks. Every time Odoacer saw a Roman aristocrat refuse to part with land, every time an imperial official delayed payment, every time his men grumbled that they'd done the fighting while others reaped the tax revenues, the idea that Rome had to be preserved at all costs would have felt thinner and thinner. And he could also see something else, how weak the old structures really were. From his vantage point, the West was no longer a vast empire. It was a shrunken kingdom in all but name, centred on Italy, held together by habit and paperwork more than by force. The emperor was a child. The supposed legitimate Augustus, Julius Nepos, was sulking in Dalmatia with no access to the Italian army. The Eastern court was far away and preoccupied. The Italian Senate was rich but militarily helpless. In that landscape, who actually had leverage? Not the boy in purple, not the exiled emperor. The people with real power were the men who led troops that could move quickly and take what they wanted. Leaders of foederati like Odoacer. He was uniquely positioned in three ways. First, militarily, he commanded the kind of soldiers the Italian government now depended on and couldn't replace. These were hard-fighting, mobile, ethnically cohesive warbands whose primary loyalty was to their own commander, not to some abstract idea of Rome. Second, socially, he stood between worlds. Roman enough to negotiate with Orestes and the Senate, barbarian enough to command the respect of his followers. That liminal position which had held other men back from the purple was exactly what made him a potential king in a post-imperial order. Third, psychologically, he could see that the taboo had already been broken. Ricimer had made and unmade emperors. Gundobad had tried the same. Orestes had overthrown Nepos and put his child on the throne. Each step had eroded the mystique of the office a little more. When the purple had become something you draped over a teenager to make your coup look respectable, the next logical question was, why bother with it at all? So when Orestes balked at giving his foederati the land grants they demanded, and tensions sharpened into open anger, Odoacer did not just see a pay dispute. He saw a structural opportunity. Replace Orestes with yet another general propping up yet another puppet, and nothing changed. The foederati would still be supplicants in someone else's system. But remove the emperor altogether, step outside the imperial script, and Italy could be reorganized on new terms, with Odoacer at the top of the pyramid, not as Magister Militum, but as king. He may not have set out to be the man who ended the Western Empire. But by the late summer of 475, the pieces were on the board, and he was the only one positioned to make a move that went beyond swapping faces on coins. All he needed was a trigger, and Orestes was about to provide it. The trigger was land, not abstract legal privileges, not honorary titles, dirt. Fields you could walk, measure, hand to your sons. By the mid-470s, that's what the foederati in Italy were openly demanding. Their request wasn't random. Across the former western provinces, that was how the game was now played. In Gaul, Visigothic warriors had been settled on Roman estates under the old practice of hospitality, the so-called third share system, where imperial officials technically didn't give up ownership of land, just a cut of its revenues. In practice, of course, that meant Goths on farms, Roman landlords learning to live with new partners who carried spears. The foederati in Italy knew those stories. Some had kin who'd gone west and come back with news of vineyards and villages now under Gothic control. Others had fought in those very campaigns. They looked around at the Po Valley, at the rich Campanian countryside, and wondered why they were still being billeted in half-ruined towns while senators' villas sparkled behind their walls. So sometime in 475 or 476, according to the later sources, their leaders made a formal demand to Orestes, assign them a third of the land in Italy. Not conquered barbarian territory, not some frontier strip, Italy itself, for a Roman aristocrat like Orestes that crossed a line. Paying troops late was negotiable, handing out bonuses when you had them was expected, but forcibly breaking up senatorial estates, the foundation of the old order's wealth and identity, that meant turning on his own class. He hesitated, he stalled, then he refused. Different chronicles summarize it in a few dry lines. The Foederati asked to be settled on Italian soil. Orestes would not consent, and so they turned to Odoacer. That pivot is the moment where personal grievance turns into political revolution. For Odoacer it was perfect timing. His men were furious, but not yet dispersed. Orestes was overconfident, secure behind the prestige of the imperial court at Ravenna, and the illusion that generals could always juggle disgruntled troops the way Ricimer had. And standing between them was a commander with enough Roman clout to negotiate, and enough barbarian credibility to lead an outright revolt. Later writers put a few boiled-down speeches into Odoacer's mouth. They have him promise his followers that if they support him, he'll get them land and rule Italy himself. Whether those exact words were spoken doesn't really matter. The underlying bargain is obvious. Back me, and I will stop asking Rome for favours and start taking what we're owed. The mutiny was less a chaotic explosion than a controlled reversal of loyalty. Foederati units that had marched under Orestes' banners simply stopped seeing him as their patron. Their true bond was to their own commander. When that commander turned, so did they. In a world where armies were held together by personal ties rather than abstract patriotism, the shift could be frighteningly swift. Orestes realized what was happening and tried to do what Roman generals had always done, pull together whatever loyal forces he could and block the road. The key was the Po Plain, the traditional approach to Ravenna. Orestes left his son and the imperial court in safety and moved north to Piacenza, Placentia, as the Romans still called it, a fortified town commanding routes across the river. It was a sensible move on paper, hold the line there, bleed the rebels in a siege, buy time for alliances and reinforcements. But he was misreading the moment. Odoacer did not face him as a ragtag band. He marched with the bulk of the Italian Foederati, men who had already proven themselves under Ricimer and in earlier campaigns. They weren't amateurs storming the walls in a rush of enthusiasm. They were professional soldiers who knew exactly how to take a fortified town when the defenders didn't greatly outnumber them and had little reason to die for their commander. The siege of Piacenza doesn't get the epic treatment in our sources. There's no long list of sorties or starvation tactics. What we see instead is compression. The rebellion begins. Odoacer advances, Orestes retreats to Piacenza, Orestes is captured and killed. That telescoping suggests something important. This wasn't a long, grinding civil war. It was a brief campaign whose outcome was obvious as soon as it started. Once it was clear that Odoacer controlled most of the field army, wavering officers would have quietly stepped aside, opened gates, or accepted terms. The prestige of the Roman general and the boy emperor no longer outweighed the immediate threat of the men outside the walls. At Piacenza, Orestes' options ran out. The chronicler Anonymus Valesianus gives it in a single sentence. Orestes was taken and executed. No heroic last stand, no tragic farewell speech recorded. One day he was Magister Militum and Kingmaker, the man who had put his own son on the throne. The next, he was simply removed, as Ricimer had removed others before him. Only this time, no new emperor was waiting in the wings. The manner of his death is sketched in only the barest strokes. He was captured, probably after the town was stormed or surrendered, and put to death soon afterward, likely by beheading. For Odoacer there was no incentive to keep him alive. A living Orestes could be a rallying point for loyalists, or a bargaining chip for Constantinople. A dead Orestes was a symbol. The old order of Roman generals playing at emperor-making was finished. His brother Paul, who tried to raise resistance further east at Ravenna, met a similar fate shortly thereafter. Two pillars of Orestes' power base gone in quick succession. What's striking is how little moralizing the contemporary or near-contemporary sources offer. There's no sense of cosmic justice, no lamentation over the fall of a great statesman. Orestes had come to power through a military coup and died at the hands of another. In that sense, his end was not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of the system he'd helped perpetuate. In the space of a few weeks, the man who had treated emperors as pieces to move on a board was removed from the board entirely, and the person now holding most of the pieces wasn't a Roman aristocrat at all. It was Odoacer at the head of victorious foederati, standing outside a still untouched imperial court, with a very simple question to answer. If you've just killed the emperor's father and smashed his army, what do you do with the emperor himself? You don't put a knife to a child's throat and call it politics. By the time Odoacer's men reached Ravenna, that was the basic problem. They had done what soldiers do in a late Roman civil war, marched, besieged, killed the rival general. But sitting at the centre of the court was someone no one quite knew how to handle. Romulus, nicknamed Augustulus, the little Augustus, was probably in his mid-teens at most, maybe younger. Our sources don't give his age. They barely give anything about him at all. He appears, he reigns for a handful of months, and then he vanishes, leaving only a title and a famous ending. So we're forced to reconstruct. Imagine Ravenna in those days. It's not a city expecting a heroic last stand. The court there had survived too many coups to believe in that sort of thing. Officials and bishops had watched emperors come and go, sometimes quietly, sometimes in blood. They knew the choreography. Troops outside the walls, negotiations, assurances of safety, and behind it all, a quiet calculation. Resist, and you might be sacked. Submit, and life might go on under yet another new order. The sources suggest that resistance at Ravenna crumbled quickly. Odoacer was already de facto master of Italy. Most of the field army was his. There was no rival general marching to the rescue, no Eastern expeditionary force on the horizon. The bureaucrats and senators in Ravenna could read a balance of power when they saw one. Which brings us to the scene that no one wrote down in detail, but everyone later agreed must have happened: the abdication of the last Western emperor. Later chronologies traditionally place this on September 4th or 5th, 476. Those dates come from retrospective calculations, not from any surviving "today the emperor fell" note. No chronicle from the time says, on this day, at this hour, the Roman Empire ended. Instead, we get something almost annoyingly minimal. The anonymous chronicle known as the Anonymous Valesianus says that after Orestes was killed, Odoacer compelled the young Romulus Augustulus to abdicate and then sent him into Campania with a pension. That's it. No speeches, no drama. One of the most symbolically loaded events in world history, and it's dismissed in a line and a half. Other writers add a few details. The 6th century historian Jordanes, summarizing earlier accounts, notes that the imperial insignia, the diadem and purple, were later sent to Constantinople. Malchus, a contemporary Greek historian whose work survives only in fragments, seems to have known something about ambassadors explaining that there was no more need for an emperor in the West. But even there, the moment of deposition itself is a blur. So we fill in cautiously. At some point, under Odoacer's authority, Romulus is brought before the new power in Italy, perhaps in the imperial palace, perhaps in the military headquarters. The texts don't say. Romulus doesn't command troops. He doesn't have a loyal guard ready to die for him. Whatever courage he personally possessed, politically he is defenceless. He's asked or told to renounce his title in Roman legal theory that matters. Emperors don't just disappear. Their authority is supposed to pass in some kind of orderly way, however fictional that order might be in practice. For Odoacer, getting a formal abdication accomplishes several things at once. It avoids the scandal of murdering a child emperor. It creates a paper trail that says, "I didn't seize the throne from a reigning Augustus. He stepped down." And then comes the strangest part of the story. Odoacer lets him live. The anonymous Valesianus, usually not sentimental, goes out of its way to note that Romulus was spared because of his youth. Odoacer grants him an estate in Campania, the villa of Lucullus, according to the text, and a stipend of 6,000 solidi a year. That's not exile in chains, that's comfortable retirement for a teenager. Measured against late Roman precedent, this is mercy bordering on extravagance. Previous usurpers and child emperors had not been treated so gently. Valentinian III's sons vanish from the record, likely killed. The boy Emperor Gratian had been hunted down and murdered during an earlier civil war. Ricimer himself had arranged deaths when emperors were no longer useful. Odoacer breaks that pattern. Why? Historians offer a few overlapping explanations. There is basic pragmatism. Killing the boy might alienate Roman elites and the church, who had a lingering respect for imperial personhood. There's political theatre. Sparing him sends a message that Odoacer is not a barbarian destroyer, but a ruler who respects Roman forms. There may even have been a calculation about legitimacy. A living ex-emperor under house arrest is easier to control than a dead martyr whose name can be invoked by distant claimants. Whatever the mix of motives, the outcome is clear. Romulus is removed from power, but not from life. After that, the sources fall silent. We don't know when he died. We don't know if he married, had children, converted a hall in that Campanian villa into a chapel. The last Roman emperor in the West dissolves into private anonymity. Notice what's missing in all this. No eyewitness narrative of the ceremony. No list of officials present. No bishop's sermon marking the end of an era. For the people writing at the time, this wasn't yet world historical. It was another in a long line of adjustments in a system already accustomed to abrupt changes at the top. Even the chronicler who gives us our most detailed account of these years, the same anonymous Valesianus, treats Romulus's fall as a parenthesis on the way to the real story, Odoacer's rule. The abdication is an obstacle to be cleared before the narrative can move on to the new king's policies, wars, and eventual fall. That's the irony. The event that later ages would fixate on, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, barely registers as a headline in the texts closest to it. The dates are reconstructed, the dialogue is imagined. The scene itself is compressed into a legal verb: depose, abdicate, retire. History, as we inherit it, wants a dramatic curtain drop. The sources we actually have offer something much more muted. A teenager signing away a crown he never really held. A general choosing clemency over blood, and a political system so used to implosion that it recorded the moment the empire fell, almost as an administrative note in the margin. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the people living through it didn't treat 476 as the end of the world, Why did no one bother to write down the exact day? Because the machine that usually wrote days down was already breaking. For most of the empire's history, dates were a byproduct of paperwork. You didn't record the great events of our time for posterity. You wrote tax receipts, legal decrees, army orders. You dated them so a clerk could later say, this was valid, this was not, from that blizzard of documents. Later chroniclers pieced together timelines. By the 470s in the West, that blizzard had thinned to a light drizzle. The imperial bureaucracy still existed in name. There were still notaries, scrinia, men in purple-bordered tunics who could quote you, Theodosian code chapter and verse. But the system they served had been carved up by war, rebellion, and sheer poverty. Tax bases had shrunk, provinces were gone. Units that once produced stacks of reports now produced nothing because they no longer existed. Even where offices survived, they were often in the hands of local magnates or barbarian generals who had other priorities than forwarding neat dossiers to some central archive in Ravenna. So imagine the day Romulus abdicated. Somewhere, yes, a scribe probably wrote a formula. On the Xth day before the nones of September, in the consulship of so-and-so, the most pious Lord Romulus laid down the imperial power by his own free will. That's how Roman legal acts like to sound. But that document, if it existed, didn't go into a secure, climate-controlled state archive. It went into a chest in an office that might be looted 5 years later, repurposed 10 years after that. Flooded, eaten by rats, burned as scrap. We don't lack the date because no one wrote it. We lack it because the system that preserved such writing was fragmenting in real time. And beyond the technical collapse, there's a geographic problem. Almost nobody whose word survived was actually there. The main narrators for late 5th century events are not Ravenna court diarists. They're later historians working in Constantinople, in Ostrogothic Italy, decades on, in distant monasteries, pulling from oral reports and half-remembered documents. Malchus, writing in Greek in the East, never claims to have stood in that room. Jordanes, condensing older Gothic histories in the mid-6th century, depends on now lost sources that themselves were not eyewitness day books. The anonymous Valesianus seems to have had some Italian information, but he's not carefully counting days. He's sketching sequences. You can see the distance in the casual way they handle time. Odoacer reigned for X years. Romulus ruled for such and such months. Reigns are measured in blocks, not timestamps. The interest is in before, after, not Tuesday the 4th at mid-morning. If you weren't in Ravenna, and you were writing 40 or 50 years later, what mattered was that Romulus fell after Orestes and before Odoacer's regular kingship. The exact day wasn't just unknown, it was unnecessary. Add to that the communication lag between Italy and Constantinople. In theory, the Eastern Court was still the arbiter of legitimacy. In practice, letters from Italy took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Messages could be delayed by weather, piracy, local war, or simply by lack of funding to hire fast couriers. So, by the time an embassy reached Constantinople saying, "The boy Augustus has abdicated, please recognise our new situation," what did the imperial secretariat do? They recorded the date the letter arrived, the date the emperor replied, maybe the consulship under which the envoys appeared. They did not treat the Italian abdication ceremony itself as a sacred coordinate to be registered in the imperial annals. For the Eastern bureaucracy, the meaningful date was when Zeno decided what to do, not when some powerless teenager in a distant, diminished court signed away titles under duress. And that points to something deeper. The event didn't obviously look like the end of Rome to the people closest to it. Romulus was not a Constantine, remaking the empire. He was not even a Honorius, presiding over multiple invasions and crises. He was a cipher, installed by his father in the middle of a military mutiny and toppled by the next one. Deposing him didn't feel unique. It looked like yet another regime adjustment in a generation packed with regime adjustments. Between 455 and 476, the West cycled through emperors at an almost dizzying rate: Avitus, Majorian, Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius, Glycerius, Julius Nepos, Romulus. Some ruled longer. Some barely got their names on coins. Several were deposed, sidelined, or killed. Did anyone solemnly record the exact day each of them fell? If they did, nearly all those dates are gone too. That's not because nobody cared about time. It's because individual downfalls had become background noise in a society numb to coups. Seen from inside that world, what Odoacer did was not to abolish an empire. He regularized a messy situation. He removed a puppet no one obeyed, kept the Senate, kept Roman law, issued taxes and orders, and then sought Eastern approval. From his perspective, this wasn't an apocalyptic break, it was a bid for stability. You don't usually call the notary in for extra flourish when your whole performance is. Let's pretend nothing fundamental has changed. There's also a methodological problem that goes beyond this one story. Late antiquity is bad at dates in general. The farther you move from the high imperial centuries, the more often our sources say in that same year, around this time, not long after. Many chroniclers used regnal years or consular names, not fixed calendars. Later copyists sometimes miscopied numbers or swapped consuls. Synchronizing one region's system with another's can require detective work. So even when a text does give you a day and month, you have to ask, which calendar? Which year counting? Which local era? A scribal error of one line can move a whole event from the 4th to the 5th. In the case of 476, later scholars in Byzantium and the Latin West tried to retrofit precise dates by cross-referencing consuls, Easter tables, and known eclipses. That's where our September 4th or 5th comes from. Reconstruction, not a surviving contemporary note. Underneath all of that is a quieter truth. History as lived is not history as later ages arrange it. The people in Ravenna were trying to keep pay flowing to soldiers, keep grain moving to cities, keep their own families safe. The boy emperor's abdication was part of that scramble, not a carefully staged finale. It slipped into the paperwork like any other administrative adjustment. And when the paperwork itself dissolves, so do the days. By the time anyone realized they wanted an exact anniversary for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the only people who might have written it down were long dead. Their archives dispersed, their crisp dating formulas reduced to ash, dust, and a tantalizing silence where a single line might once have read, "On this day, the Augustus laid down the purple." So if the people in the room didn't leave us a timestamp, who did? The answer is nobody. Not directly. What we have instead is a chain of later voices all looking back, all trying to turn a blurry sequence of upheavals into a neat chronological line. Start with one of the most important of them, Marcellinus Comes. He's not a Roman senator in Ravenna. He's an official in Constantinople, writing in Latin, probably in the early 6th century. By his time, Odoacer is dead, Theoderic the Ostrogoth has ruled Italy for decades, and the story of the last Western emperor is already a thing you tell in the past tense. Marcellinus writes a chronicle, year-by-year entries, short and sharp. Under the year 476 he drops the line that would echo through textbooks: Romulus, nicknamed Augustulus, is deposed, and the Western imperial rule comes to an end. No day, no ceremony, no description of the scene, just a sentence, compact and confident, like it was always obvious that 476 was the year everything stopped. But how did Marcellinus know that? He's at least 30-40 years removed. He's in the East. He almost certainly never met anyone who stood in that Ravenna audience hall. He's drawing on whatever materials the Eastern bureaucracy and Eastern libraries still had, old letters, lost histories, imperial archives that did survive. He gives us the crucial headline, Romulus out, 476, Western emperors no more. But his neatness is an illusion. He compresses a messy process into a clean turning point. Then there's Cassiodorus. Unlike Marcellinus, Cassiodorus is embedded inside the new order in Italy. He serves Theodoric the Great, then other Ostrogothic rulers, as a high official and spin doctor. He writes letters on behalf of the king that quote Roman law and scripture in equal measure. He's the one in charge of saying, on parchment, "Nothing fundamental has changed. Rome still lives under her new Gothic guardians." Later in life, he sits down to write a chronicle of the world, the Chronica. For the 5th century, he leans on earlier sources we no longer have, maybe including Marcellinus, maybe including now lost Italian annals. He has every incentive to frame the timeline in a way that makes the Goths look like restorers, not destroyers. So when Cassiodorus touches on the end of Western emperors, he isn't interested in the legal minutiae of Romulus's abdication. He's interested in drawing a line from corrupt, unstable imperial regime to wise rule under Theodoric. The deposition of Romulus becomes one stepping stone in a teleology that ends with Gothic order. His dates are often similar to Marcellinus's, but his emphasis is different. Rome doesn't fall. It hands over, it transitions, it is rescued. The timeline is being massaged to fit a political story. Then, a few decades after Cassiodorus, we meet Jordanes. Jordanes is writing in mid-6th century Constantinople or its orbit, condensing, summarizing, and reshaping an even larger, now lost work by Cassiodorus about Gothic history. That work, the Gothic History or Historia Gothorum, was essentially a giant PR project for the Ostrogothic regime. Jordanes turns it into a shorter, punchier narrative, the Getica. By the time he writes, Justinian's armies have already invaded Italy. The Ostrogothic state Cassiodorus served is collapsing. Jordanes is looking back at a world that is already fading. In the Getica, the story of Odoacer and Romulus is woven into the broader saga of the Goths, Heruli, and other so-called barbarians. Dates are vaguer. Sequences matter more than precision. The important thing for Jordanes is that before Theodoric there was Odoacer, and before Odoacer there was this shadowy late imperial mess. He roughly agrees that Romulus is deposed, and that after him no Western emperor is set up in Italy. But his year counts, reign lengths, and synchronizations sometimes wobble when you try to map them onto Marcellinus or Eastern chronicles. His focus is narrative coherence, not astronomical accuracy. Now put these three voices side by side, Marcellinus's terse entry, Cassiodorus's chronicle shaped by Gothic politics, Jordanes's Gothicized synthesis, and you start to see the problem. They line up on the big beats, Orestes rebels. Romulus is set up, Odoacer overthrows him. Italy moves under a king of the Heruli, and then a Gothic king. But when you ask, exactly when, their answers blur. Marcellinus tells you a year. Cassiodorus confirms the drift. Jordanes folds it into a story where the dates sometimes slip a year or two depending on which manuscript you read. Other late sources, like the anonymous Valesianus, some Eastern Greek historians, later medieval compilers, add their own fragments. One might say Odoacer ruled for 14 years. Another gives the length of Romulus's reign in months. Another ties an invasion or a battle to a particular consulship. On their own, none of these snippets will tell you it was September 4th, but together they set constraints. If you know that in such and such consulship Orestes is still alive, but by the next consulship Odoacer has been ruling for some months, you can narrow the window. If an Eastern chronicler ties an embassy from Odoacer to a certain year of Emperor Zeno, and an ecclesiastical chronicle ties a church council or an Easter date to that same year, you can start triangulating this reign length here, that consular name there, an eclipse or a Passover calculation, anchoring the whole structure. This is what modern historians do. Not read one source and trust it, but spread the whole messy pile on the table. They ask, where do Marcellinus, Cassiodorus, and Jordanes agree? Where do they diverge? Which of them is more likely to have had access to an official list of consuls? Whose numbers look suspiciously rounded? Who has a clear political motive to shift things a bit? They then cross-reference that with coins, with inscriptions, with papyri from Egypt that mention imperial names, with Eastern legal texts that mention our colleague in the West or suddenly stop mentioning him. Out of that puzzle a probable timeline emerges, not certain. Probable, you can say, with some confidence, that Romulus was deposed in 476. You can say with slightly less confidence that it was late summer or early autumn. Push further and you get those modern textbook dates, September 4th, September 5th, built from synchronizing consular lists and Easter tables with the regnal counts preserved by later chroniclers. But the key thing to remember is, those specific days live at the end of this long chain of reconstruction. They are not the day as written down by some Ravenna notary. They are an educated guess, assembled out of Marcellinus's terse line, Cassiodorus's Gothic-friendly framework, Jordanes' epic of the Goths, and the obsessive patience of modern scholars. In other words, the chronology we use to talk about the fall of the Western Roman Empire is itself a late antique and modern creation, a careful stitching together of scattered memories, political narratives, and numerical hints from people who never expected us to care so much about which day the boy in the purple cloak finally took it off. While modern historians are busy reverse engineering dates from scraps of evidence, the people actually living through 476 were doing something very different. They were sending a package. Somewhere in the aftermath of Romulus's quiet removal, Odoacer and the men around him made a decision that no source describes in cinematic detail, but several allude to in a way that's hard to mistake. The imperial regalia of the Western court, the insignia of office, the symbols that said, "This is not just a powerful general, this is an emperor," were gathered up and dispatched east to Constantinople to Emperor Zeno. We're not told exactly what was in that shipment. Later writers just talk about insignia or signs of empire. But we know what imperial paraphernalia meant in Roman political culture. The diadem, the purple garments, the imperial standards, the things that turned an ambitious commander into the embodiment of the res publica. To send those away was to say, in a language every Roman bureaucrat understood, there will be no more emperor here. That act is one of the reasons 476 ends up feeling so decisive in retrospect. You can imagine all kinds of ways Odoacer might have played this. He could have set up his own puppet emperor, some other boy in purple. He could have had himself proclaimed Augustus, like so many soldiers before him. He could have pretended nothing fundamental had changed. He doesn't. Instead, he has the West's imperial costume physically removed from Italy and shipped to the one man who, in Roman legal theory, still unquestionably has the right to wear it. It's an astonishingly clear message. On one level, it's submission. Odoacer is saying to Zeno, I am not challenging your status. I'm not claiming to be a rival emperor. I'm acknowledging that there is only one Augustus now, and he lives in Constantinople. On another level, it's a negotiation tactic, because along with the regalia went an embassy, and with the embassy went a proposal. The Western court is gone. The Western throne is vacant. The Western army follows me. Let's make this official. The story, as later writers reconstruct it, goes something like this. The Roman Senate, reduced, cautious, still clinging to its own sense of importance, sends a letter to Zeno along with Odoacer's envoys. In that letter, they suggest that a single emperor in Constantinople is enough for the entire empire. No need to appoint a new Western colleague. Italy will govern itself under Odoacer in the name of the one universal emperor. It's a clever framing. Rome isn't rejecting imperial authority, it's streamlining it. It's not begging the barbarian for mercy. It's co-signing an arrangement that keeps a Roman Senate in business. Zeno's position is complicated. On paper, he already has a Western emperor, Julius Nepos, the man Orestes pushed out in 475 and who is still alive, ruling a fragment of the old Western realm from Dalmatia across the Adriatic. In strict legal terms, Nepos is the legitimate Augustus in the West. Romulus was an usurper, and Odoacer is a rebel general who has just toppled a usurper. So, when Odoacer sends the regalia and the message, the Western throne is empty. Zeno can't just say, "Great, thanks, I'll take it." That would mean abandoning Nepos and admitting that power in the West now comes from swords, not from imperial appointment. The sources suggest Zeno tries to straddle the gap. He keeps up the fiction that Julius Nepos is still the Western emperor, at least on parchment. He tells Odoacer, according to later accounts, to govern Italy as Nepos's representative, to recognize Nepos's name on coins and in official acts. In other words, Zeno's answer is, "I hear you, but the legal order still exists." At the same time, he doesn't send an army to restore Nepos to Ravenna. He doesn't refuse the regalia and insist on reinstalling a court in Italy. He accepts the symbols, he acknowledges reality, and he recognizes Odoacer. Not as emperor, not as consul, as something older, less Roman, but very clear. King. From this point on, Odoacer appears in our sources as Rex Italiae, King of Italy. It's a strange hybrid position. In theory, he's ruling with the blessing of the Eastern Emperor under the umbrella of a still unified Roman Empire. In practice, he's an independent monarch who commands the army, pays the troops, negotiates with neighbours, and parcels out land to his followers. His kingship is wrapped in Roman legal language. He issues edicts with a Roman law-trained staff. He cooperates with the Senate. He allows Roman titles and offices to continue. But the top of the Western political pyramid is no longer a man in purple called Augustus. It's a soldier king whose authority flows from his control of armed men and from a nod, however reluctant, from Constantinople. For contemporaries, this could look like just another adjustment in a long series of imperial power-sharing arrangements. The empire had gone from 1 Augustus to 2, from 2 to 4 under Diocletian, back to 1, back to 2. Court moved from Rome to Milan, to Ravenna to Constantinople. Emperors died, were overthrown, were replaced. From the inside, Odoacer's regime could be sold as another turn of the same wheel. For historians looking back, the moment when the regalia leave Italy has a different flavour. This is when the symbolism and the reality finally line up. For decades, the Western imperial court had been shrinking in real power while clinging to its titles. Emperors were created and discarded by generals like Ricimer and Gundobad. The army was full of non-Italian federate troops. Tax bases were eroding. But as long as a man called Augustus sat in Ravenna, and the imperial insignia remained on Western soil, there was at least a claim that the old structure still existed. When Odoacer packs up that symbolism and sends it east, he is in effect calling the bluff. He's saying what everyone in Italy's power circles already suspects: there's no functional need for a separate Western emperor anymore. The costume can go back to the wardrobe department in Constantinople. We'll handle things here. That's why later writers from Marcellinus to Gibbon treat this as more than a procedural detail. It's not that the empire falls in a single day when a teenager is deposed. It's that, soon after, the people who could have kept pretending there was a Western empire decide not to bother. The act of surrendering the regalia turns a de facto situation into a de jure shift. It makes explicit what had been implicit. It writes, in objects rather than in ink, a statement that can't easily be walked back. The West no longer needs its own Augustus. And once that message is sent, there is no obvious way to unsend it. If all of this sounds like a constitutional earthquake, you might expect the sources from 476 to be buzzing with shock. They aren't. When we look at the writers who were actually alive and putting pen to parchment in the 470s and 4080s, what jumps out is not dramatic language about apocalypse, but how mundane their concerns remain. Contemporary chroniclers who do mention Odoacer usually do it in passing. They'll note that he became king, that Romulus was deposed, sometimes that Julius Nepos was murdered a few years later in Dalmatia. Then they move on. No, thus ended the Roman Empire in the West. No, on this day the world we knew came crashing down. That silence is striking mostly because we know what it sounds like when late Roman writers think the world is ending. Go back to 410, when Alaric and his Goths sack Rome itself. We have letters from people like Jerome, sitting in Bethlehem, practically shaking with horror. Augustine in North Africa writes anxiously about pagans claiming the Christian God has failed them. The sack becomes a theological crisis, a philosophical problem. How could the eternal city be violated? The language is desperate. People compare it to the fall of Troy, then jump forward to 455, when the Vandals hit Rome even harder, looting for 2 solid weeks and carting off treasures and captives to Carthage. Again the rhetoric ignites. Bishops, chroniclers, court poets describe the devastation, the humiliation, the sheer sense of moral and political breakdown. Even if their accounts are stylized, you can feel the emotional charge. In both 410 and 455, the event is framed as a catastrophe, a sign that something fundamental has gone wrong with Rome and with the world. Now compare that to 476. There is no surviving sermon thundering that God has abandoned the West because a teenage emperor has been retired and a soldier king is in charge. No philosopher sits down to write a treatise titled On the Fall of the Empire. No panicked letter from a provincial governor saying, "We no longer have an Augustus. What do we do?" Instead, what you see is continuity. Laws continue to be issued in Italy. Courts still sit. Taxes are still, however, imperfectly collected. Bishops still argue about doctrine, not about whether the Roman state exists. The church councils that meet in these decades are preoccupied with heresy, discipline, and property disputes, not with the loss of an emperor in Ravenna. For most people in Italy, the things that structure daily life, the estate you work on, the landlord who owns it, the bishop who can intercede for you, the tax collector who shows up every so often, the markets that pop up on certain days, don't abruptly transform because Odoacer is now Rex instead of a boy called Augustus. If you're a peasant in Campania, the state is a very distant abstraction. The man you actually fear is the local magnate whose fields you plough and whose guards make sure you don't run off. That man might now cultivate favour at Odoacer's court instead of Orestes's, but the rent is still due. The harvest still has to come in. The roads, to the extent they are maintained, are maintained by the same local networks of obligation and patronage. Even in Rome itself, the shock is muted compared to 410 or 455. The city is no longer the imperial capital. It hasn't been for decades. The real administrative centre was Ravenna, and before that Milan. Rome is a symbol, a senatorial playground, a religious hub. When Romulus is deposed in Ravenna, the streets of Rome don't suddenly fill with Goths or Vandals. No one is pulling statues down. No one is burning the Forum. And the senatorial elite, the families that still pride themselves on their ancient lineage, that still meet in the Curia, that still control vast rural estates. They adapt. Our glimpse of their reaction mostly comes through later summaries and scattered references, but the pattern is clear. They work with Odoacer. They send embassies with him. They hold office under him. They accept him as the man you go to if you want a legal dispute settled, a tax privilege confirmed, an honorific title renewed. This isn't because they've suddenly stopped being Roman and fallen in love with barbarian kingship. It's because they've spent the last half-century learning to live under strongmen who control the army while emperors come and go. By 476, senators have already navigated Ricimer, Gundobad, and a string of short-lived emperors. They've seen generals make and unmake Augusti. They've written flowery panegyrics for one ruler, only to compose a new one for his successor a few years later. So when Odoacer presents himself as King of Italy, backed by troops and tacit Eastern recognition, the senatorial instinct is not to stage a heroic last stand for the institution of the Western emperorship. It's to adjust their rhetoric and carry on. They present their cooperation as loyalty to the unified empire, as obedience to Zeno's arrangements. They stress continuity in law, religion, and senatorial dignity. They make sure their sons can still become consuls, even if the consulship is now as much ceremony as substance. They avoid describing what's happening as an end, and instead fold it into Rome's long, complicated habit of reinventing its power structures. And that's really the key to why no one at the time slaps a big apocalyptic headline on 476. From inside the system, this moment doesn't necessarily look like the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It looks like yet another renegotiation of how imperial authority is packaged. One emperor instead of two. Not unprecedented. A powerful military strongman running things in the West. That's been the norm for decades. A court disappearing from one city and resurfacing in another. Late Roman politics has been playing that game since the 3rd century. To us, with our hindsight and our timelines and our desire for turning points, the combination of Romulus's deposition and the sending of the regalia feels clean and dramatic. It's easy to draw a straight line and write end in big letters. To contemporaries, the line is blurrier. There is no visible sudden collapse of administration across Italy. No immediate, empire-wide financial implosion that they can date to a single overthrow. No empire-wide announcement that the West is now officially done. There is just a new pattern of commands, seals, and signatures arriving from a different man at the top. The institutions that matter to literate elites, the Senate, the law courts, the bishoprics, are still there. The empire in the East is still thriving. The Roman name still carries weight. And so the language of catastrophe, the rhetoric of finality that surrounds 410 and 455, never quite attaches itself to 476 in the way we might expect. In their eyes, history hasn't ended. It has, yet again, changed costume. The drama of collapse is something later generations will write back onto this moment. The people living through it are too busy figuring out how to keep their estates, their offices, and their communities intact under a king named Odoacer to declare that the world they know has just died. From Constantinople's point of view, none of this meant that Rome had ceased to exist. If anything, it confirmed what Eastern emperors had been saying for decades: there is only one Roman Empire, and it lives in me. By the late 5th century, the men sitting on the throne in Constantinople did not think of themselves as rulers of a separate Byzantine state. That word is a historian's convenience, invented more than 1,000 years later. Zeno, Anastasius, Justinian. These people call themselves Basileus Romaion, Emperor of the Romans. Their laws are Roman law. Their subjects are Romans, the imperial bureaucracy, the gold coinage, the great Christian councils. They all speak the same language of continuity. In their legal fictions, the division of the empire into East and West is just an administrative delegation, not a divorce. 2 emperors, 1 res publica. So when one of those emperors disappears, the other doesn't sigh and say, well, that half of the Roman Empire is gone, he says. The arrangement has changed, but the empire is still here, and I'm still its emperor. That's the mental world Zeno is living in when the envoys from Italy show up with the imperial regalia, and the story that the Western army has no more use for a separate Augustus. To him, the message is not: the Roman Empire in the West is finished. It's: we've simplified things. You are now the only emperor, which is how it should be. By the way, here's the guy we'd like you to recognize as running Italy on your behalf. Because that's the crucial bit. Constantinople does not treat Odoacer as the founder of an independent kingdom equal to the Roman Empire. It treats him as someone asking to be slotted into an already familiar category: barbarian strongman governing Roman territory under imperial authority. They have a template for this. For generations, Eastern emperors have been granting titles and salaries to Gothic, Vandal, and other leaders, calling them foederati, patricii, magister militum. The label shifts, the tone shifts, but the underlying idea is the same. You may rule, but you rule because Rome permits you to. So when Odoacer writes to Zeno, he doesn't proclaim himself king of a new Italy. He uses Roman titles, asks for Roman honours, frames himself as the loyal servant of the one emperor. Zeno, after some hesitation and political manoeuvring, plays along. He never agrees that the Romans of Italy no longer belong to the empire. He simply acknowledges Odoacer as patricius, as a sort of governor, in fact. On paper, Italy is still an imperial province. The Senate in Rome still dates its official acts by the Eastern emperor's regnal years. Consuls are still appointed in both East and West, and those consulships are recognized across the unified empire. Coins minted in Italy often bear the name and image of the Eastern Augustus. Imperial laws issued in Constantinople circulate westward and are cited as authoritative. From a Constantinopolitan desk, you could plausibly believe that you still ruled the old heartland of the empire, only now through a muscular intermediary with long hair and a lot of Germanic warriors. This fiction becomes even more elaborate when Odoacer is removed and Theodoric the Ostrogoth takes over. Here the arrangement is almost textbook Roman. Zeno doesn't simply tolerate Theodoric's conquest of Italy, he commissions it. In theory, Theodoric is not carving out a state for himself. He is leading imperial troops to depose a disobedient official and restore proper order in a Roman province. When Theodoric settles in Ravenna, he adopts the language of continuity even more aggressively than Odoacer had. He keeps the Roman Senate, Roman offices, Roman law. He has consuls, praetorian prefects, quaestors. He dresses in Roman ceremonial robes on some occasions and lets his Gothic warriors keep their own customs on others. He issues edicts framed explicitly as restorations of Roman order. On the ground, everyone knows the truth. Ultimate coercive power lies with the Gothic king and his army. But in letters, laws, and diplomatic exchanges, The legal story is that Theodoric is a loyal representative of the Roman emperor, guaranteed his position by imperial recognition. Later emperors in Constantinople maintain this stance long after any practical ability to intervene in Italy has eroded. They protest when their territories fall under new rulers. They negotiate with Gothic kings as if dealing with rebellious governors, not foreign monarchs. They bestow titles and consular honours on Western aristocrats as though they still hold jurisdiction there. This stubbornness isn't just denial, it's strategy and self-definition. For the Eastern court, acknowledging that Rome has fallen in some grand final sense would mean admitting that the Roman Empire is a thing of the past, that they are something else, Greeks perhaps, or just one more regional monarchy among many. That is absolutely not how they want to frame themselves. So they emphasize continuity wherever they can. They insist that there is still a Roman Senate, even if it now convenes more often in Constantinople than in the Forum. They continue to codify Roman law, culminating in Justinian's massive legal compilation in the 6th century. They convene ecumenical councils of the Church as Roman emperors, not as heads of a small Eastern state. They build monuments and churches that consciously echo earlier Roman forms, from triumphal arches to domed basilicas. Most importantly, they keep using the Roman name. Outsiders might call them Greeks or use ethnonyms like Byzantines centuries later, but internally, down through the Middle Ages, they call themselves Romaioi Romans. Their capital is the New Rome. Their emperor is the Roman emperor. Their empire is the Roman Empire. In that mental universe, what happened in 476 is a serious regional realignment, not the end of a civilization. Italy is problematic. Italy is contested. Italy is slipping out of effective control. But frontiers have shifted before. Provinces have been lost before. Emperors in the 5th century can look back to the 3rd century crisis, when whole regions briefly broke away, only to be reconquered. They can imagine, or at least tell themselves, that something similar might happen again. What they do not do is write a date in a chronicle and label it the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. For them, there is no in the West as a separate co-equal thing. There is just the empire, which continues, wounded but alive, wherever the emperor in Constantinople can plausibly claim authority. And because they keep that claim alive so fiercely, on coins, in law codes, in church politics, later generations looking back from the East never latch onto 476 as their apocalypse. Their own disasters, their own end times, will come centuries later, with Persian invasions, Arab conquests, Crusaders, and finally Ottoman cannons, which means that when an 18th century historian eventually decides that 476 is the fall of Rome, he is not echoing how Romans in Constantinople saw their world. He is imposing a clean, dramatic line on a story that, for them, never really broke. That clean, dramatic line has a name attached to it, Edward Gibbon. In the late 18th century, sitting in a very different empire, a very different capital, Gibbon decided that Rome did fall decisively, and that if the Romans themselves hadn't bothered to put a date on it, he would. He opens his The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire with one of the most quoted sentences in historical writing, that he sat musing among the ruins of the Capitol in Rome while barefoot friars chanted vespers in the Temple of Jupiter. For him, that contrast, pagan grandeur reduced to Christian poverty, was the key to the whole story. He was not writing a dry chronology. He was crafting an enormous moral drama. In Gibbon's telling, the empire is like a tragic hero in a classical play. It rises to virtue and strength, then slowly corrupts itself with luxury, superstition, and despotism, until at last it collapses. To make that story land, you need beginnings and endings. You need act breaks. You need a final curtain. So Gibbon went looking for one. He had the same scattered late sources we've been talking about, Marcellinus, Jordanes, later chronicles. He could see that power in the western provinces frayed over a long time. He knew there were emperors, usurpers, barbarian generals, and that imperial institutions limped on under Gothic and then Frankish rulers. But he also saw something that appealed deeply to his literary instincts. The little boy with the loaded name, Romulus Augustulus, and the barbarian soldier who deposed him. The first emperor of Rome had been Romulus. One of the greatest emperors, in traditional memory, was Augustus. Here at the end, you get a child whose name fuses both Romulus, the founder, and Augustulus, the little Augustus. He's not even legally legitimate. He's too young to matter politically. He's a shadow wearing a great name. And then along comes Odoacer, not even claiming the purple himself, just pushing the boy aside and sending the trappings of empire east. For a writer like Gibbon, raised on classical rhetoric and tragedy, this is irresistible. It feels like the universe has given him a perfect ending. A symbolic unfounding of Rome performed on a child with a mythic name, followed by the removal of the imperial insignia from Italy. So he takes that image and promotes it from one important moment in a long process to the final fall. He does it in a way that sounds cautious and scholarly. He talks about the extinction of the Western Empire rather than the fall of Rome as a whole, but in the popular imagination the distinction melts away. Readers remember the scene, the child emperor retired, the barbarian general ruling Italy, the regalia shipped to Constantinople. They remember the number Gibbon pinned to it, 476. It helps that Gibbon is not just any historian. He's one of the great stylists of the English language. His sentences are balanced, ironic, memorable. He writes with a kind of cold, controlled disdain for what he sees as superstition and barbarism. He spares no opportunity to contrast the rational virtues of classical antiquity with, in his view, the credulity of the Christian Middle Ages. That philosophical agenda matters here. Gibbon is writing as an Enlightenment thinker. He believes in reason, in secular progress, in the power of human intellect freed from priestcraft. So when he looks at the long transformation from late antiquity to medieval Christendom, he doesn't see continuity under new forms or creative adaptation of Roman traditions. He sees decay. For him, Christianity is part of the problem, not the solution. He famously argues that the triumph of the Church weakened the civic virtues of Rome, diverted energy into theology and monasteries, and helped hollow out the empire from within. A story like that demands a before and an after, a world of pagan emperors in togas, and a world of bishops and barbarians in chainmail. 476 becomes the hinge. It is the point where the old political shell in the West finally cracks in a way even a casual reader can understand. No more emperor in Rome, no more Western Augustus. After that, in Gibbon's narrative, you live in a post-Roman world, a long decline into what he freely calls barbarism and religion. Of course, the reality he's compressing into that hinge is a mess. We've seen that Eastern emperors go on calling themselves Roman. We've seen that in Italy itself. Roman law, Roman offices, and Roman aristocrats keep functioning under new masters. We know that people in Gaul, Spain, and Africa don't wake up in 477 and say, well, that's that then, we're medieval now. But Gibbon is not primarily interested in how late antique senators in Ravenna experienced their lives. He is interested in how to turn 1500 years of complicated history into an intelligible moral arc for 18th century Britons and Frenchmen. To do that, he needs a few clear signposts: the Antonine Golden Age, the crisis of the 3rd century, the reign of Constantine, the sack of Rome by Alaric, and then, as the final Western act, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. By placing a narrative spotlight on that last event, he in effect invents it as the end date. Before Gibbon, you can find scholars who point to different turning points. Some medieval writers talk about the sack of 410 as a watershed. Others focus on Justinian's losses in the 7th century, or the Arab conquests, or the coronation of Charlemagne. There is no universal agreement, after Gibbon, in the age of mass literacy and national school systems, that changes. His book becomes a classic. It's abridged, translated, summarized. 19th century historians, often sharing his taste for grand narratives and his suspicion of the Middle Ages, happily adopt his markers, textbook writers, who have to compress everything into neat timelines and exam questions, absolutely love a date like 476. It's crisp, it's teachable, it fits on a line between ancient Rome and the Middle Ages. So children in Britain, France, Germany, America grow up with this in their heads. Rome fell in 476. The Western Roman Empire ended when Romulus Augustulus was deposed by Odoacer. That intellectual move, turning a long transformation into a single red ink date on a classroom timeline, cements Gibbon's framing not just among historians, but across entire societies. The irony is that the people living through the 5th and 6th centuries had nothing like that clarity. For them, power bled slowly from emperors to generals, from emperors to kings, from Rome to Ravenna, to Constantinople to Aachen. Names changed, titles shifted, languages evolved. There were no big banners in the sky declaring end of era. Gibbon gives us those banners. He gives us the satisfying clunk of a door closing. And once you've heard that door close on 476, it's hard to unhear it, even when the evidence, the laws, the coins, the letters from Constantinople all whisper that history on the ground was much less tidy. Which raises a bigger question. If 476 is, in some sense, a literary invention, what should we use instead? If Rome didn't fall cleanly on that date, when, if ever, did it fall? One answer is 480, not 476, not the deposing of the boy, but the quiet murder of another man, in another city, 4 years later, Julius Nepos. If you were a legalist sitting in Constantinople, Nepos, not Romulus Augustulus, was the last legitimate Western emperor. He'd been properly appointed by the Eastern Court. He'd ruled briefly in Italy before being forced out by Orestes. When Orestes set up his own son as emperor in Ravenna, the East refused to recognize the boy. In their eyes, Nepos was still Augustus, just ruling in exile from Dalmatia, hugging the eastern shore of the Adriatic. From 475 until 480, this awkward situation continues. There is a man out there who signs laws as perpetual Augustus, mints coins with his imperial titles, and is mentioned in Eastern legislation as if he is still the rightful Western colleague. Odoacer even puts Nepos's name on coins in Italy for a while, because it gives his own regime a veneer of legality. Then, in 480, Nepos is assassinated by his own soldiers in his villa near Salona. There is no replacement. No one in the West even tries to put forward a new emperor. The Eastern Court makes a deliberate choice. They call Zeno sole emperor, and do not elevate a substitute for Nepos. If you care about constitutional continuity, this is a much cleaner break than 476. Until Nepos dies, there is at least one man somewhere who can plausibly claim to be Western Augustus. After he's gone, there isn't. The office, as a legal reality, lapses. You can draw your red line there, but you don't have to. You could move it another 13 years to 493 and argue that Rome doesn't really fall until Odoacer himself does. Because remember, for all the drama we attach to 476, very little actually changes on the ground in Italy that year. The Senate still meets. The tax system still functions. The same landowners still hold their estates. Odoacer formally rules on behalf of the Eastern Emperor, even if in practice he does what he wants. What he does not do is tear up the Roman script. He keeps Roman administration. He keeps Roman law. He takes Roman titles. He's a barbarian king, yes, but he's a barbarian king wearing a Roman mask, propped up by a Roman elite that knows no other way to run a state. In 489, another player enters, Theodoric, leading the Ostrogoths west at the invitation of Emperor Zeno. 4 years of brutal war follow. In 493, Theodoric invites Odoacer to a feast in Ravenna, an event that's supposed to seal a power-sharing agreement. Instead, at some point during the banquet, Theodoric strikes him down with his own hand. Odoacer's family is slaughtered. His followers are butchered or forced into exile. The Ostrogoths seize Italy, and a new regime begins. If you're less interested in imperial job titles and more interested in who actually controls land, armies and cities, this feels like the real rupture. The king of Italy, who had grown up as a Roman soldier, is dead. A new Gothic monarchy, with its own people and power base, takes over. Land is reallotted to Gothic warriors. The social composition of the ruling class shifts in a way that 476 never produced. So you could plant your flag at 493 and say, here, this is when the post-Roman illusion in Italy ends, and a real Gothic kingdom is born. Or, if you zoom out further, both 480 and 493 start to look parochial. They're local rearrangements, important. If you live in Ravenna, less important if you're thinking about Rome as a Mediterranean system. That perspective pushes some historians to much later dates, tied not to collapse but to failed recovery. In the mid-6th century, Emperor Justinian in Constantinople decides that the loss of the western provinces is not inevitable fate, but a reversible accident. Under his generals Belisarius and Narses, eastern armies reconquer North Africa from the Vandals, large parts of Italy from the Ostrogoths, and footholds in southern Spain. Roman law is codified in the famous Corpus Juris Civilis. Imperial power once again stretches from the Atlantic almost to the Euphrates. If you're standing in the 5040s, it looks like a restoration. The empire is back, but the cost is staggering. The Italian wars devastate the peninsula. Cities are besieged, starved, burned. The population crashes. The state's resources are drained. While the army is pinned down in Italy, a new enemy, the Lombards, prepares to move. By 568, just 3 years after Justinian's death, Lombard warbands pour into a shattered Italy. They carve out duchies and kingdoms, many of which will last into the early Middle Ages. Byzantine control is pushed back to coastal enclaves and a corridor linking Ravenna to Rome. The dream of a reunited Roman Mediterranean is over. You can mark that failure in different ways. Some pick 554 when Justinian issues the Pragmatic Sanction reorganizing Italy as a province. After that, everything is downhill. Others choose 568 when the Lombards invade, or 572 when they take Pavia and establish a long-term capital. Still others point to the later 7th century, when the empire decisively loses most of its eastern and African territories to Arab conquests and becomes a more compact Greek-speaking state centered on Constantinople. In that reading, Rome doesn't fall in the 5th century at all. It mutates, shrinks, and is finally broken by the combined weight of plague, war, and new powers on its borders. The fall is not Odoacer in Ravenna, but the loss of Carthage in 698, or the effective abandonment of Latin as an imperial language, or the moment when an emperor like Heraclius starts calling himself Basileus of the Romans in Greek instead of Augustus in Latin. And then there's an even more radical position that we shouldn't talk about a fall at all. This is the continuity school. In their view, The whole obsession with end dates is a historian's illusion, encouraged by textbooks and timelines. If you look at law codes, at city councils, at land ownership, at the church, what you see from the 4th to the 8th century is not a cliff, but a slope. Slow transformations, regional variations, overlapping identities. The senators in 6th century Rome still quote Virgil. Bishops debate doctrine using categories invented by late antique theologians in imperial councils. The barbarian kings issue edicts in Latin, administer Roman law to Romans, and present themselves as heirs, not destroyers, of imperial authority. When Charlemagne is crowned emperor in 800, his propagandists insist they are reviving the Roman Empire, not inventing something new. From this angle, the real story is not Rome ends, but Rome seeps into everything. Its institutions dissolve into medieval kingdoms. Its law passes into canon law and continental civil codes. Its language fractures into Italian, French, Spanish. Its idea of empire lives on in the Holy Roman Empire, in Russian Tsars calling Moscow the Third Rome in modern nation-states that still build parliaments with columns and domes. So when did Rome fall? You can pick 480 and the death of the last legal Western emperor. You can pick 493 and the murder of the man who replaced that emperor with a king. You can pick 568 and the Lombard invasion, 698 and the loss of Carthage, 800 and the moment a Frankish king claims the imperial crown for himself. You can argue that there is no single day, just a centuries-long unbraiding of Roman into 100 different strands. Historians keep arguing about this not because they're bad at calendars, but because the question is really about what we mean by Rome. Are we talking about a city? An office? A legal system? A culture? A self-image? Change the definition and the date moves, which leaves us with an odd conclusion. The neat ending everyone learns, 476. A boy deposed is both wrong and, in a way, revealing. It tells us less about the people living through the 5th and 6th centuries, and more about what later ages wanted from Rome, a story with a beginning, a climax, and a fall. Meanwhile, in Italy, after 476, after 480, after 493, life goes on. Fields are ploughed, taxes are collected, children are born into a world that is still recognisably Roman in some ways, and utterly changed in others. To see what the fall of Rome looked like from their point of view, you have to stop staring at end dates and start looking at everyday life. If you were one of those people in Italy, what did after Rome actually feel like? Start in 480, or 490, or 500. Pick a year that looks like post-Roman in a textbook, and zoom in until the timelines blur into lived experience. You're a landowner outside Ravenna. Your grandfather served in the field army under Majorian. Your father complained bitterly about barbarians getting commands that used to go to proper Romans. You, by contrast, have grown up with Odoacer as a fact of life. On paper, almost nothing looks revolutionary. The land tax still arrives as a demand written in Latin, using formulas that would have been familiar to officials 200 years earlier. You still bring lawsuits before magistrates who cite imperial rescripts and quote the Theodosian Code. The gold coins in your strongbox bear the image of an Eastern emperor. Odoacer calls himself not Augustus, not emperor, but king and patrician, a Roman title granted, at least fictionally, by Constantinople. He is brutally pragmatic. He does not have the numbers or the administrative tradition to run Italy with Gothic or Syrian customs, so he doesn't try. He preserves Roman institutions because they work, and because the people who know how to operate them are the same senatorial families who have been doing this for generations. The Senate, that ancient body, still meets in Rome. It has nowhere near the power it boasted under the Republic, or even in the early Empire, but in the 5th and 6th centuries it experiences a kind of strange afterlife. Senators are rich landowners, bishops, patrons. They send embassies, issue acclamations, debate tax remissions, lobby the king. They cannot make emperors anymore, but they can still make or break policies on the ground. Odoacer needs them. He confirms their privileges. He lets them administer their own estates under Roman law. In return, they legitimize his rule, put his decisions into the familiar language of imperial rescripts, maintain the machinery of cities and courts. From the perspective of Constantinople, Odoacer is an awkward compromise, a barbarian in control of Italy who nevertheless mouths the right formulas, sends occasional embassies, and keeps pretending the emperor in the East is his superior. From the perspective of an Italian senator, he is a known quantity, a soldier king you can negotiate with, who understands that the road system must be maintained, that harvests must be protected, that statues and churches in Rome carry real symbolic weight. For ordinary Italians, the continuity is even more striking. If you are a peasant on a latifundium in Campania, your world is defined less by who calls himself king in Ravenna, and more by whether your landlord raises rents or the harvest fails. You still owe rents in kind. You still labour a few days a week on your landlord's demesne. You still go to church on Sundays, hear homilies in Latin, maybe slipping towards spoken romance, but framed entirely in references to the Bible, to Augustine, to imperial church councils. Soldiers still pass through, but the colour of their cloaks and the shape of their brooches might be a bit different. Some speak Latin with heavy accents. Some worship as Arians rather than Nicene Christians. But the tax collector's demands look the same. The bishop's authority feels the same. The village elders still settle most disputes long before they reach any royal court. This is the paradox of after Rome, at the level of political theory, the Western Empire has vanished. At the level of daily practice, people keep living in institutions that are thoroughly, stubbornly Roman. When Theodoric and the Ostrogoths arrive, this pattern doesn't break, it deepens. Theodoric is more than a warlord who has killed his rival at a banquet. He is a man who grew up as a hostage in Constantinople, who absorbed Roman court ritual as a child. When he takes Italy, he too wraps himself in Roman language. He calls himself king, not emperor, but issues edicts in Latin that look, feel, and function like imperial laws. He keeps the Senate, he cultivates it. Great senators like Boethius and Cassiodorus serve in his administration. They write letters on his behalf that are masterpieces of high Latin rhetoric, full of classical allusions. Reading them, you'd be hard-pressed to tell whether you're in the age of Theodosius or Theodoric. The Goths become a new military aristocracy layered on top of an old Roman world. They are settled on land, yes, but not by exterminating the previous owners. Instead, there is a complicated process of reallocating tax receipts and legal claims, often on the theory that a Gothic warrior is now entitled to a share of revenues that used to go to absent imperial soldiers. In practice, that can mean conflict, dispossession, and violence. But it can also mean negotiated compromises where Roman landowners keep their estates while acknowledging Gothic beneficiaries. The legal arguments take place in Latin, in Roman courts. The category Goth is a legal status as much as an ethnic label. From the street level in Rome itself, the Ostrogothic takeover might barely register at first. The aqueducts still bring water, the bakeries still grind flour. The great baths are in worse repair than they once were, but some still function. The games have grown rarer and less lavish, but the circus is not yet silent. The Bishop of Rome, by now an increasingly important figure, the Pope in embryonic form, still presides over councils, negotiates with kings, dispatches letters across the Mediterranean. Theodoric patronizes building projects, repairs walls, funds churches. He wants to be seen as a restorer, not a destroyer. In some ways the city is better defended and more politically stable under his long reign than it had been in the chaos of the mid-5th century. So how much of Rome survives these changes? If by Rome you mean a specific imperial office in the West, that's gone. There is no Augustus sitting in Milan or Ravenna. There are no Western imperial court ceremonies, no consuls nominated by a Western emperor, no imperial edicts issued in his name. But if you mean a way of running a state, written law, trained bureaucrats, tax registers, city councils, a self-confident senatorial aristocracy that survives surprisingly well into the Ostrogothic kingdom, Theodoric is in many ways a Roman king in Gothic dress. His rule is a hybrid, with separate legal traditions for Goths and Romans, but the backbone is still Roman jurisprudence and administration. If you mean Rome as a culture, a shared reverence for Latin literature, for Roman law, for the Christianized memory of the empire, that not only survives, but spreads. Barbarian kings compete for Roman legitimacy. They mint coins with imperial images, sponsor Roman schools, hire Roman secretaries to put their rule into elegant Latin. The real change is more subtle. It's in the slow shift of loyalty away from a distant, abstract empire and toward closer, more tangible powers, a Gothic king in Ravenna, a Lombard duke in Spoleto, a pope in Rome. It's in the creeping provincialization of Italy, as Mediterranean trade thins and local economies matter more than seaborne connections to Africa or the East. To someone living through it, this doesn't look like a cataclysmic fall. It looks like a series of adjustments. New rulers at the top, old systems repurposed underneath. A world that is still anchored in Roman habits, but where Roman has become an adjective you attach to law, to language, to prestige, not a living empire with an emperor you can see. And yet, even in this half-Roman, half-Gothic Italy, people keep talking about the Romans, about our laws, about the res publica. The memory of Rome remains a yardstick, a vocabulary for power. That memory, more than any single emperor or city, is what 476 never managed to kill. So how did this messy, half-Roman, half-barbarian reality end up boiled down to one clean number? 476. In schoolbooks, in documentaries, in casual conversation, 476 isn't just a year. It's a thunderclap, the fall of Rome, full stop. Lights out, curtain down, civilization over. It's a powerful story because it does something our brains love. It turns a long, confusing transformation into a single dramatic moment. A date you can memorize, a before and an after. Once, Gibbon and his successors started using 476 as a convenient bookmark, it began to accumulate meaning far beyond what actually happened in Italy that autumn. It became shorthand for civilizational collapse itself. When people warn that we're living through another 476, they don't mean a minor bureaucratic change in who forwards documents to Constantinople. They mean the fear that a whole way of life could disintegrate. They picture aqueducts cracking, libraries burning, cities emptying, knowledge lost. 476 turned into a symbol, not of a specific political event, but of the idea that even the mightiest empires can die. The problem is that the symbol and the history don't line up very well. The symbol says, one day there was Rome, the next day there were barbarians, and everything sophisticated vanished in a crash. The history says by 476, the Western imperial office was already hollowed out. Military strongmen had been making and unmaking emperors for decades. Barbarian federates already held vast territories inside the imperial borders. The grain ships from Africa were already threatened. Tax systems were already fraying. The symbol says the lights went out. The history says in Italy, law courts kept running, senators kept scheming, bishops kept preaching, and the big shocks, the real demographic and economic gut punches, were still to come with the Gothic Wars and the later Lombard invasions. Modern historians have spent the last century or so trying to push back against the simplicity of Rome fell by talking instead about transformation. In this view, the 4th to 7th centuries aren't just a story of collapse, but of slow change, Roman provinces turning into medieval kingdoms, imperial aristocrats turning into local lords, imperial Christianity turning into the network of bishops and monasteries that will define the Middle Ages. You can see why transformation is attractive. It captures how much continuity there was in places like Italy, Gaul, and Spain. It explains why so much Roman law, language, and culture survives inside the so-called barbarian kingdoms. It reminds us that peasants kept farming, craftsmen kept working, and people kept marrying, praying, and paying rents through all of this. But there's a counter-argument too. Talk to archaeologists working in Britain or parts of Gaul, and transformation can sound like a euphemism. They see cities shrinking or abandoned, coin circulation plummeting, fine pottery disappearing, literacy retreating, long-distance trade networks fragmenting. For them, there really is a before and after, and the after looks poorer, smaller, and rougher. So the debate isn't just collapse versus no collapse, it's collapse where, for whom, and over what timescale. 476 sits right in the middle of that argument. On the one hand, it's clearly not the universal cliff edge, the old narrative imagined. On the other, it's not meaningless either. It marks the moment when, in the West, nobody even bothered to pretend there was still a Roman emperor of their own. That fiction died, and with it a certain political imagination died too. What makes 476 so revealing isn't that it's the day Rome fell. It's that we want there to be such a day in the first place. The fact that we latch onto this uncertain autumn with its lost exact date and its quiet paperwork tells us something about how history gets written. We like sharp lines and clean breaks because they make stories easier to tell. A child can remember 476 equals fall of Rome. A textbook can draw a neat boundary between ancient and medieval. A politician can invoke another 476 as a warning about decadence and decline. Reality, with its overlapping timelines and regional variations and half-Roman Gothic kings, is harder to fit into a slogan. So we compromise. We turn a fuzzy process into a crisp symbol. We teach the symbol first, then spend the rest of the time explaining why it's wrong, or at least why it's only part of the truth. And yet the fascination doesn't go away. We keep trying to pin down exact turning points. The day the stock market crashed, the moment an archduke was shot, the hour a wall came down, the autumn when a boy emperor handed over his diadem. We search for hinges on which the whole world seems to turn. 476 is one of those hinges, not because everything changed at once, but because later generations decided to hang their fears and hopes on that year. It's a mirror we hold up to Rome, but also to ourselves. If the fall of Rome can be reduced to a single line in a chronology, then maybe our own world has a line like that too, lurking somewhere in the future. A last normal day before everything is different. But when you look closely at 476, the line blurs. Instead of a guillotine cut between civilized and dark, you see a web of continuities and slow breaks, of memories and reinventions. That, more than anything, is the legacy of 476. Not a definitive ending, but a cautionary tale about how badly we want endings to be simple and how rarely the past cooperates. So where does that leave us? We've spent this whole episode circling around a single stubborn fact. The so-called fall of the Western Roman Empire is one of the most famous events in world history, and nobody who lived through it thought it was important enough to write down the exact day. No diary entry, no imperial edict noting the date, no bishop pausing mid-sermon to say, "By the way, mark your calendars, the West just lost its last emperor." Instead, what we have is silence. A blur of months in 476 where the court politics in Ravenna shifted. A teenager lost his job title, a general gained a crown he couldn't quite name, and the paperwork to Constantinople started going out under a different signature. The headline was written later. That's the central irony. The more dramatic the story has become in our imagination, the less precise the ancient record actually is. The day Rome fell exists more clearly in modern textbooks than it did in any contemporary chronicle. And that tells us something fundamental about how history works. History, as we usually meet it, is already processed. It's been filtered through generations of choices about what counts as important. Chroniclers in late antiquity cared a lot about bishops arguing with heretics, the outcome of church councils, and whether a particular general won or lost a battle. They did not care as much about whether a teenage figurehead in Italy kept the title Augustus or not, especially once it was obvious that someone else was calling the shots. For them, Romulus Augustulus wasn't last emperor of the West, symbol of a world ending. He was just another forgettable puppet at the tail end of a long string of forgettable puppets. Only much later did scholars, and then schoolteachers, and then popular culture turn his quiet deposition into a pivot point for all of Western civilization. So when we go hunting for the exact day Rome fell, what we're really doing is running into the mismatch between what later ages wanted the past to mean and what people at the time thought was worth writing down. The archives preserve what mattered to someone, somewhere, in the moment. They don't preserve what we wish they had noticed. That's why so many of the clean dates we memorize are, once you zoom in, just as messy as 476. The fall of the Aztec Empire, the beginning of the French Revolution, the discovery of the New World, none of these are single, clear breaks when you're living through them. They're sequences, rumours, experiments, half measures, reversals, improvisations. The headline comes at the end, when someone needs to package that sequence into a story. And even then, who gets to write that headline matters. Gibbon, writing about Rome in the 18th century, had his own fears and prejudices, about religion, about luxury, about barbarism. Later historians pushed back, bringing in archaeology, coins, climate data, regional studies. Each generation rewrote the caption under the same blurry photograph. What 476 shows us is that the past isn't a tidy row of dominoes falling one by one. It's more like overlapping waves. Politics, economy, culture, religion, climate, they crest and break on different shores at different times. Italy in 476 is not Britain in 410, is not Gaul in 530, is not North Africa under the Vandals. Trying to cram all of that into one dramatic fall of Rome date is like trying to pick a single second that the tide went out. This doesn't mean dates are useless. It means they are tools, not truths. They help us organize a chaos that was never as simple as a timeline on a classroom wall. If there's a takeaway from 476, it's this. When you hear a big story with a single magic year attached to it, ask what had already changed long before that date and what kept going long after. Ask whose perspective that date reflects and whose experiences it leaves out. And ask what we're doing right now that future historians will try to compress into one neat number. 2008, 2020, 2050. Which slow-motion transformations are we living through that don't feel like turning points yet, because there's no headline to tell us they are. That curiosity, the willingness to look past the slogan and into the mess, is the real antidote to oversimplified history. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this journey through late Roman Italy and the invention of 476, thank you. These are complicated stories, and the fact that you're willing to wrestle with the nuance is exactly what keeps channels like this going. If you found this episode useful, or if it made you rethink that clean fall of Rome date you learned in school, take a second to like the video. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of long-form history. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, city, country, whatever you're comfortable sharing, and how 476 was taught, or not taught, where you are. Did you grow up with the dramatic last Roman emperor story, or something more nuanced? And if you want to support this show in the best possible way, follow the podcast on Spotify. There's a link down in the description. Listening there, following the show, and sharing episodes you enjoy does more than any algorithm tweak ever could to keep this project sustainable. History rarely gives us perfect dates. It gives us fragments, arguments, conflicting memories, and a lot of silence. The work is in assembling those pieces into stories that are honest about the mess, without pretending there was ever one single day when everything changed. If that's the kind of history you want more of, stick around. There's a lot more past to untangle.